In 2007, Tom Hanks produced and starred in Charlie Wilson's War, a movie about a Texas congressman's efforts to funnel billions of dollars through the CIA to the rebel forces of the Mujahideen fighting off the Soviet military in Afghanistan. In 2024, we released an equally long YouTube video talking about how these efforts played a huge role in driving Afghanistan into becoming a narco state before falling into the hands of a radical Islamic extremist. This would ultimately lead to 9/11 and a massive influx of heroin into the world market. It's good stuff, you should check it out, but you don't actually need to see it to follow what I'm going to get into here. This movie largely steers clear of these seedier topics and does the audience a disservice, both because this history is important and because it's just a far more compelling story than the whitewashed version they decide to tell. But another failure of this film that I didn't touch on is that it never actually explains why the Soviets are in Afghanistan, which feels important, right? I mean, even if we set aside historical accuracy as a concern here, it's just bad for the narrative. I know next to nothing about screenwriting, but everything that I do know I learned from a video on YouTube called Aaron Sorkin being a screenwriting genius for 10 minutes straight. This had some legitimately interesting nuggets in it, one of which was that the key to writing a good villain is to not treat them as one.
And my best tip is that you cannot think of them as a villain.
And this rings true to me. To get a really deep, well-rounded villain that you can engage with, you need to understand what they want and why they are the way that they are. It seems like a historical period piece such as this would be a great way to explore this, since there's a ton of interesting characters in both Afghanistan and the Soviet Union that you can play with. And the roots run extremely deep here. But instead, we get the story told from the perspective of a man half a world away who is seemingly less interested in Afghanistan than he is in Julia Roberts' vagina. Only one Afghan is ever named in the movie, and the only Soviets who show up just do this. That's it. They just mow down helpless civilians and then they get blown up. You can't help but think that this movie could have presented a much more interesting narrative if it had been written by a guy like Aaron Sorkin instead of Aaron Sorkin. Wait, really? Damn, okay. Well, you know what? Fine. If Aaron Sorkin doesn't want to flesh this thing out, I'll do it myself. But before I do, I just want to mention that we currently have a promotion on Patreon where your first month is 50% off if you sign up between now and the end of November using the promo code BURNER. We post once a month there, and it's usually early access content for upcoming videos, but also long-form podcasts where we go over the videos we post here and talk about stuff we didn't include and respond to comments. In light of our videos getting demonetized on YouTube, any help there is greatly appreciated. With that out of the way, let's talk about Afghanistan. I'm going to tell you the side of this story that you will never find in a movie. I'm going to tell you why the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, why it matters today, and why it will always matter in the future. In our last video, we introduced some major figures in the Soviet-Afghan War. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was a radical heroin trafficking warlord receiving billions of dollars from the US, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. Ahmad Shah Massoud was adeptly commanding his forces in the north, even though he was largely being neglected and resented by the very same forces propping up Hekmatyar. Despite their rivalry with one another, both men were nominally working towards the same goal, the overthrow of President Najibullah, the head of Afghanistan's communist government, and in their eyes, a puppet of the Soviet Union. The battles waged under their banners would take the lives of well over 1 million people. But this story does not begin in the months leading up to the Soviet invasion. If we want to understand what brought these men to this point, we need to start at the beginning. To understand how this war played out, we need to understand who our principal players are. And to do this, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of Afghanistan's history in the 20th century. If you read enough about the country, you'll quickly learn that Afghanistan has come to be known as the graveyard of empires. This title is meant to signify that when a wealthy country tries to conquer it, they always fail. But this name can only really exist due to recency bias. It feels true because both the Soviets and the US failed to bend the country to their will. But as anthropologist Thomas Barfield describes it, Afghanistan spent most of the past 2,500 years as part of somebody's empire. It wasn't until 1879 that the term Afghanistan was used to describe an actual state rather than a region. This was found in a treaty between the British government and Yaqub Khan, who was described as the emir of the region. When the leadership of Afghanistan fell to Emir Abdul Rahman Khan, he made efforts to centralize the country into something more closely resembling a modern state. As with most other modern states, this was done with a tremendous amount of violence, as he put down 40 revolts, with a handful being considered civil wars. In addition to this, he carried out a genocide against the country's Hazara population, killing over 60% of them. When he died in 1901, his throne would pass to his son Habibullah, who was assassinated in 1919, leaving the throne to his son Amanullah. The new king would launch a brief war for Afghan independence from the British, and because of the latter's weakened state after World War I, he was successful. The Soviet Union would be the first nation to recognize the independent state of Afghanistan, and they returned the favor, becoming one of the first countries to recognize the Bolshevik government. Amanullah enacted the first Afghan constitution, but was overthrown by General Mohammad Nadir Shah, who was made king in 1929. He would rule with an iron fist for a couple of years before being assassinated for it in 1933. His brothers would then proclaim his 19-year-old son Zahir as king, though the brothers largely ran the country in his name. And surprisingly, things largely cooled down by this point. The country enjoyed nearly 50 years of relative stability, the likes of which they have never approached since. In 1953, Zahir's uncles named his cousin Daoud Khan as prime minister, a role through which he basically ran the country for 10 years. Daoud would try to push modest progressive reforms through, but pretty much every time he's met with resistance from the country's religious right wing, either on the grounds of their reverence for the country's traditional tribal structures, or for outright religious reasons. Despite having some pretty obvious disagreements with monarchy as a political structure, the Soviets are generally supportive and think that Daoud is doing a pretty decent job of modernizing the place. He eased restrictions on women and took on some vital infrastructure projects. In some instances, Daoud would turn to the US for assistance, but would be turned down for political reasons. When he wanted to build up his military, the US was unwilling to help because they couldn't give them aid through Pakistan, a country that Daoud was getting into border skirmishes with. So instead, Daoud's military was largely armed and trained by the Soviet Union. Many of them would come back from their training, hoping to make Afghanistan look a lot more like the USSR, which would have pretty dire consequences for Daoud in a few years. While the Soviets were happy to build up friendly relations with a Muslim country on their southern border, the US wasn't all that fixated on the country for a couple reasons. Part of it was that the US already had Iran as a close ally in the region, so Afghanistan wasn't really essential for keeping tabs on the Eastern Bloc. Perhaps more importantly, the US was more interested in building closer ties with Pakistan at this time. Daoud had been in a bit of a dick measuring contest with the Pakistani government over where the border drawn between the countries, known as the Durand Line, should go. He began funding tribal militants carrying out raids across the border, which caused Pakistan to close down their border entirely. This forced the Afghan government to rely more heavily on the Soviets to keep their economy from completely imploding. In order to open the border back up, Daoud was forced to resign as prime minister in 1963. This meant that 30 years after he was named king, Zahir Shah finally started to actually govern the people of Afghanistan. He attempted to turn the country into a constitutional monarchy, and his constitution was passed by a National Assembly in 1964. The years that followed would be called Afghanistan's Decade of Democracy, but this kind of overstates things. King Zahir still held all the power and could dismiss the prime minister and call new elections whenever he wanted. According to scholar Barnett R. Rubin, the political parties who may have actually helped this parliament function were all still illegal, and as a result, they had 3 elections and 4 governments within the next decade without accomplishing a whole lot. Now, for all his faults as an ultra-wealthy monarch in a country full of extreme poverty, Zahir Shah is something resembling a liberal. So although there are no political parties, people can organize for political causes more freely. Over the years, the country sees advances in the rights of women who are largely foregoing the veil in the capital city of Kabul. This openness also leads to the establishment of the Islamic Law Facility at Kabul University, which would quickly become a breeding ground for Islamic extremists who were not all that pleased with the liberated women in their city. On the other side of the spectrum, the military academy would begin to bubble up with left-wing ideas, as many of their students were trained in the Soviet Union and had become committed communists. Now, it's important to keep in mind that Afghanistan has always relied on foreign aid to function. At this point, they're finding a decent balance between the Soviets and the Americans, but the Vietnam War would ultimately lead the US to reduce their foreign aid to the country. This would disproportionately impact the country's education system, ramping up radicalization among the students, but perhaps more importantly, the cuts would contribute to a drought in 1973 that would kill approximately 20,000 people, most of whom were Hazaras. As the political temperature rose and King Zahir Shah was out of the country, his cousin and former Prime Minister Daoud would stage a bloodless coup, making himself president and establishing Afghanistan as a republic. Interestingly, although Daoud was a moderate, some of his strongest supporters in the coup were the communists in the armed forces. The president then immediately embarked on a campaign of repression against his potential foes. This included dissolving parliament and arresting Mohammad Hashim Maiwandal, who had served as prime minister under the king. His death would then be ruled a suicide when he was found hanged in his prison cell shortly thereafter. Now, to close out on this section, I want to give you a good idea of where the country stood. After decades of reformist governance under King Zahir and President Daoud, the country was summarized by author William Bloom as having
a life expectancy of about 40, infant mortality of at least 25%, absolutely primitive sanitation, widespread malnutrition, illiteracy of more than 90%, very few highways, not 1 mile of railway, most people living in nomadic tribes or as impoverished farmers in mud villages.
That is really bad. For reference, the nearby Central Asian republics under the Soviet umbrella boasted far higher living standards than Afghanistan in every way. Sure, they were corrupt to some extent, and the government apparatus was repressive by Western standards, and maybe even by Soviet ones, but these countries had legitimate claims to having, quote, one of the highest rates of literacy, the best healthcare system, and the highest general standard of living found anywhere in the Muslim world. So it's easy to understand why many in the military with direct experience living in the Eastern Bloc returned home with the hopes of transforming their country along similar lines. But before we get to the left-wing dissidents in Afghanistan, let's start with the right. Perhaps the most important figures in the long-term development of Afghanistan would be the radical Islamists coming up at the University of Kabul. The story of how radical Islam came to take over Afghanistan runs parallel with the life of my least favorite Afghan, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Long before he established himself as a CIA-subsidized heroin trafficking jihadi mob boss, he was born in the northern province of Kunduz in the fall of 1948 to a fairly wealthy family. He was a devout Muslim throughout his childhood, but it wasn't until his teenage years that he turned radical. Now, Hekmatyar is a bit of an unreliable narrator, but he claims that his political awakening occurred when he was in the 10th grade during an argument with a group of students from Kabul. Among them was a boy named Asadullah, whose uncle Hafzullah Amin was a high-ranking member of the Afghan Communist Party. Asadullah would antagonize Hekmatyar by advocating for communism and asking him if he could prove the existence of God, which Hekmatyar believed to be an absurd question. With this, he concluded that the communists were not just enemies of the monarchy, but also his faith. According to him, this schoolyard beef was the beginning of his lifelong crusade against communism. Some have suggested, however, that this is a lie to cover up a more inconvenient origin story. The Task Force on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare in the US House of Representatives would claim decades later that Hekmatyar had attended the military academy in Kabul and that he was a radical leftist ordered to infiltrate the Muslim Brotherhood and discredit them on behalf of the Soviet Union. For their part, Hekmatyar's party would deny this, and the accusation never really did much damage to him because many of his peers had actually begun their careers in politics as communists before switching teams as well. But for what it's worth, I think that if there's any truth to this claim that Hekmatyar was working with the left, I would imagine the US had the relationship reversed and he was actually infiltrating the communist movement on behalf of the Islamists. But regardless of his origins, Hekmatyar would soon attend Kabul University and join the Radical Muslim Youth Organization. Here, he would be mentored by the Dean of Islamic Law, Ghulam Muhammad Niazi. From the sidelines, Niazi would assist... It looks like Nazi every single time I see it. From the sidelines, Niazi would assist Hekmatyar in becoming one of the main players in pushing their toxic brand of far-right politics while keeping enough distance to keep himself out of trouble, for now. Hekmatyar would deliver speeches on campus excoriating communists and imperialists, but he especially hated those who called themselves Democrats, believing that such an idea was alien to the country. One of his most frequent opponents while confronting communist campus demonstrators was a beefy medical student named Najib. The Muslim youth came to see Najib as a brutish caveman who could not be tamed, but we'll come back to him a little bit later. By the 70s, the conflicts between the right and the left would continue to ramp up to the point that Najib's brother was stabbed, Muslim youth activists began throwing acid in the faces of women who did not cover themselves appropriately, and they ultimately murdered a Maoist student on Hekmatyar's orders, earning him 18 months in prison. Rather than slowing his rise to power, this made him a martyr among his followers, and bolstered his popularity further as he would be chosen as the Muslim youth's political director while still serving his sentence. Beyond just hating liberals and communists in Afghanistan, Hekmatyar and his allies had much broader goals in mind for their movement. One of Hekmatyar's closest friends and leader of the Muslim youth, Habib-ur-Rahman, would tell their followers in a speech that both the Soviet Union and the United States were enemies of Islam and that the latter was the ancient enemy of the Muslims. It was these ideas, which had been passed down by their intellectual forebears in Egypt, that would ultimately poison the minds of their future Arab recruits, leading them to form Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now, it's important to remember that at this point in time, the city of Kabul looks nothing like what we would expect it to look like today under the Taliban. It's not as liberal as one might expect from the photos people post online, but it doesn't look like a theocracy either. Women largely had the freedom to dress as they pleased, to the point that Niazi actually raised suspicions from the government when his female students started to wear veils. A few years later, Daoud would ultimately intervene in the growing Islamic movement by removing Niazi as Dean of Islamic Law, replacing him with a more moderate but still fundamentalist scholar named Burhanuddin Rabbani, who would appoint a man named Abdul Rab Razul Sayyaf as his deputy. Despite being deeply conservative, Rabbani refused to join the Muslim youth as Niazi had, and for this, Hekmatyar and his peers found him arrogant and mistrusted him, which would turn into a huge problem in the coming decades. This is when Daoud's repression began to reach the college radicals. Professor Niazi would be stuffed in an overcrowded prison for the duration of Daoud's term as president, while Habib-ur-Rahman was taken into custody in November of 1973 and never seen again, as he was executed a few years later. Not long after, Daoud's men would attempt to arrest Rabbani as well, but he would flee to Pakistan before they could get their hands on him. It was here that the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, forged their long-standing relationship with the Afghan radicals. This was convenient because Daoud was pursuing his long-standing beef with Pakistan by sending arms to a nationalist uprising in Balochistan province while continuing to make an issue of the British-drawn Durand Line separating the two countries. In response to this, the ISI began training the Muslim youth in guerrilla warfare so they could wreak havoc back home. Although Rabbani kept his distance from these activities, Hekmatyar threw himself in headfirst as he saw his opportunity to wage a global jihad that he always wanted. In the summer of 1975, Hekmatyar and his allies in the Muslim youth attempted to overthrow Daoud with the help of the ISI. Their goal was to stir up trouble in the countryside to distract the government, then have their sympathizers in the military stage a coup in Kabul. The operation would ultimately fail because although Daoud had created a repressive police state, people in the countryside were not so affected by it that they wanted to take up arms against him. In the Panjshir Valley, the locals denounced the attackers from the Muslim youth as common criminals rather than soldiers of God. This meant that when the military rolled in, the Islamists opted to flee rather than fight, leading many of them to be killed in the process, while their collaborators in the armed forces were arrested. This failure would create a schism among the Islamic radicals that would prove to be deadly over the next 2 decades. This divide emerged as one of the lower-ranking members of the Muslim youth, Ahmad Shah Massoud, would blame Hekmatyar for the failed coup and lay the deaths of his peers at his feet. During the coming Soviet-Afghan war, he would distinguish himself as one of the best guerrilla fighters of the 20th century, but at this point, he was simply known as a relatively quiet, even unremarkable member of the organization. Although he had joined the movement due to his fundamentalist politics, he found he had more in common with the relatively moderate Rabbani than he did with the jihadist Hekmatyar. The insurrection's failure would drive an even further wedge between the two. The situation would worsen as Hekmatyar and other members of the fundamentalist leadership came to believe that their failures were the work of a mole. After numerous interrogations and bouts of torture, they would conclude that their financial officer, John Mohammed, an extremely popular member who was responsible for keeping Hekmatyar and Rabbani together, was the one leaking information to the government. Now, it's difficult to say how true this is because although he did admit to the allegations, this confession came after a month of horrific abuse at the hands of his interrogators. For what it's worth, Mohammed did claim that his alleged espionage had been sanctioned by Rabbani and named Massoud as a co-conspirator as well. With this, the radical Islamic movement had set the stage for a future civil war. Rabbani hated Hekmatyar because he was too extreme, Hekmatyar hated Rabbani because he thought he was an arrogant traitor, Massoud hated Hekmatyar because he blamed him for the deaths of his friends, and Hekmatyar hated Massoud because he thought that he was a government shill. I'm not a fan of religious fundamentalists, so I can't say I love any of these guys, but as far as their relationships with each other go, they're all making some good points here. They all had ample reason to hate one another, and they would continue to do so. But within a few years, they would all briefly shift their focus to what they perceived to be Afghanistan's greatest evil, the communists. The Afghan communist movement would truly start to organize itself in 1965 with the founding of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or the PDPA. Its principal founders were journalist Nur Mohammad Taraki, schoolteacher Hafzullah Amin, and student activist Babrak Karmal, all of whom would become important figures in the years to come. The party was funded by the KGB from the get-go and was almost immediately split into 2 factions. The Khalq wing, meaning the people or the masses, and the Parcham wing, meaning banner. The Khalq faction was led by Taraki and Amin and was made up of poorer Pashtuns who pushed for a radical revolutionary program akin to that of Stalin. The Parcham faction, on the other hand, tended to be better educated, more moderate, and contained more Tajik and Uzbek members. They were perhaps best exemplified by their leader, Babrak Karmal, whose family was one of the wealthiest in Kabul. From the very beginning, the PDPA is well represented in the armed forces as the Soviet Union is largely funding and training the Afghan military. Many Afghan military officers would go away to the Soviet Union and return with their hearts set on turning their homeland into something similar. But this did not mean they necessarily had their eyes set on a communist revolution anytime soon. When Daoud seized power in 1973, he did it with the support of the military and the endorsement of the communists, particularly the Parchamites. Now, what exactly Daoud's politics are is hard to pin down. Most books I've read will call him a conservative or a centrist, while others have gone as far as calling him a socialist. I lean more to the former than the latter, but I think the most accurate description for him is a developmentalist. He was attempting to take a country that had feudal property relations in much of the countryside and turn it into a modern state. Whether you're right-wing or left-wing, that process will require the intervention of a strong state and investment from wealthier countries. He understood this, and this is what the Parchamites were supporting. During his time as president, there was some degree of free speech, political pluralism with multiple parties, suffrage for women, and education for kids. He spends his time trying to strike a balance between the Soviets and the Americans, and for a time, he actually does a pretty decent job of it. The Russians like him because they think he's slowly but surely modernizing the country, and they explicitly instruct the PDPA to, quote, combine their efforts at giving comprehensive aid to the Republican regime of President Daoud Khan. And the Americans like him because he's not a communist. The country is far from perfect, but it probably could have carried on like this for a while. Until it met the same fate that so many imperfect but functioning countries met during the Cold War. Political polarization ramped up and everyone decided to get fucking stupid with it. Daoud's hold on power started to slip when he decided to heed some really bad advice from the CIA's favorite ghoul in the region, the Shah of Iran. In an effort to reduce Soviet influence in Afghanistan, Iran attempted to set up a $2 billion economic aid agreement. They would also use their infamous secret police service, the Savak, to notify Daoud of suspected communists in the military and his administration. They focused particular attention on the Parchamites, despite them being instrumental in bringing Daoud to power in the military coup. With this, the PDPA's alliance with the government slowly disappeared as Daoud said he would turn Afghanistan into a one-party state which banned political opposition, dismissed his communist allies, and started training his military in countries like India and Egypt rather than the USSR. By 1977, he became increasingly worried about his position and began to arrest more of his opponents, no longer focusing on the Islamic opposition, but now detaining and even executing some of the leftists as well. And at this point, he's not paranoid. The PDPA is absolutely planning to get rid of his ass, but let's be clear about what's happening here. The PDPA was participating in the democratic structures that existed in Afghanistan, and the Soviets supported this. It was only when Daoud changed the rules of the game, such that the PDPA could effectively no longer participate in Afghan politics, that a coup started to take shape. Given how things shook out for the country, I think it's fair to say this was the wrong call, but overthrowing an authoritarian government so that you can actually affect change in your country is not a crazy thing to do. The coup really started to take shape when a high-ranking member of the Parcham faction of the party was killed under suspicious circumstances on April 17, 1978. Mir Akbar Khyber had been an extremely popular figure in Afghanistan over the prior decades. Coming out of Kabul's military university, he took part in a failed nationalist coup plot to overthrow King Zahir Shah and was sentenced to 7 years in prison for it, though his family was never told what happened to him. Having effectively disappeared, Khyber's mother spent years searching for him before dropping dead, while his wife and brother would disappear as well, never to be seen again. When he was finally released, he would turn to communism and began working at the Kabul Police Academy, where he would convert many officers in both the police and the military to his cause. Although he had tried to stay out of intra-party disputes, his hope for a more gradual approach to implementing communism in Afghanistan placed him in firm opposition to the Khalq wing of the PDPA, and even the Parcham wing to some extent. He allegedly told a young party member,
"Look, if I make a call, I can take power. We have friends in government, but keeping power is very difficult. Taraki and Karmal want to enter the palace one day. If all of Afghanistan dies, it doesn't matter to them."
In the long term, we will see that this quote was shockingly prescient, but in the short term, we'll see that the party had now lost a well-respected, moderate voice, and they immediately sought to capitalize on this. The general consensus at the time was that Daoud's security forces had assassinated Khyber, though some blamed his death on Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Increasingly, it has been alleged that his death may have been organized by the Khalq leader Hafizullah Amin as a way to remove an intra-party rival and foment a revolution. Regardless of who actually did it, that is precisely what happened. Khyber's funeral was a lightning rod for political discontents as thousands hit the streets to demonstrate against the government, causing the police to stage a violent crackdown. While Mohammad Taraki and Babrak Karmal sat in prison on April 25th, Hafizullah Amin was able to send word to his allies in the military to initiate a coup against Daoud. When all was said and done, Daoud and his entire family were killed alongside as many as 2,000 others in what became known as the Tsar Revolution. Naturally, everyone leapt to the conclusion that the Soviets had spearheaded the coup, but the evidence here is not particularly strong. Vladimir Khrushchev, the head of the KGB, would claim that the PDPA did not inform them of their plans because they knew they would not approve of them. One should be skeptical of the claims of the KGB in this regard, but it's really not like the Soviets hated Daoud, and as we'll see, it's not like they really loved most of their allies in the PDPA either. I'm skeptical that this was a KGB operation for a few different reasons. The first is that the leaders of the Soviet Union allegedly found out about the coup through reading Reuters, meaning they had not been briefed on what was going on. Brezhnev, the old as shit general secretary of the Communist Party at the time, was also, by all accounts, not super happy about the news, probably because he and his peers were not optimistic about a socialist economy emerging out of a country that was largely still doing feudalism. The second reason is that, as I mentioned earlier, a ton of Afghans were trained or educated in the Soviet Union. If you ever heard about the US doing coups in the Third World, it's always the guys that were trained in the US that end up wielding the big stick. But in this case, it didn't pan out that way. Although Taraki had been on the KGB payroll, the first cabinet that was organized after the revolution contained a combination of military and civilian representatives. Only the 3 military personnel in the cabinet had been trained in the USSR. The civilian portion, on the other hand, was educated in the US, Egypt, Western Europe, and Afghanistan. It seems to me that if the Soviets wanted a government even more friendly to their interests, they probably would have made sure they had some homegrown talents in the cabinet. As it would turn out, the government they ended up with was, less than ideal. The Afghans would go on to install Nur Muhammad Taraki as the president of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Now, if you remember, Taraki was the head of the Khalq wing of the party, which tended to be less educated, more rural, and more radical than the Parcham faction. Taraki fancied himself a Leninist, telling KGB agents at the Kabul station,
"Lenin taught us to be merciless towards the enemies of the revolution, and millions of people had to be eliminated in order to secure the victory of the October Revolution."
Now, I'm no Leninist myself, but I'm pretty sure he didn't think that you could just force a socialist revolution through any time, any place, so long as you kill all of your enemies. And I'm not alone in thinking this. Steve Cole wrote in his book Ghost Wars that Brezhnev and his inner circle found the PDPA leadership to be, quote, dense, self-absorbed, and unreliable. And that they had, quote, taken their Moscow-supplied revolutionary textbooks much too literally. They were moving too fast. Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB and soon-to-be head of the Soviet Union, was very specific in identifying Afghanistan as a place where Lenin's teachings on revolution simply did not apply, saying,
"It is completely clear to us that Afghanistan is not ready at this time to resolve all of the issues it faces through socialism. The economy is backward, the Islamic religion predominates, and nearly all the rural population is illiterate. We know Lenin's teachings about a revolutionary situation. Whatever situation we are talking about in Afghanistan, it is not that type of situation."
He didn't quite stick the landing on the end of that thing, but hot damn, was he ever correct. The PDPA, attempting to do Leninism, ran into a couple huge issues right out of the gate. Number one, Mohammad Taraki was simply not Lenin. No matter how much he tried to build a cult of personality around himself, it wasn't happening. Number two was that the Bolshevik Revolution was long and bloody and could only be won because the Bolsheviks were legitimately popular and had the numbers to win a civil war against their enemies. The PDPA, on the other hand, was believed by the KGB to have
less than 1,000 members in the army. Together with another 2,300 supporters among civilians, the membership was no more than 11,000.
Which, to put into perspective, is not that much in a country with nearly 13 million people in it. For this reason, the Soviets largely agreed with the Parcham faction of the PDPA that Afghanistan required a slow and steady approach to reforming out of the country's feudal relations to avoid provoking a popular resistance. The Khalq faction, however, disagreed and wanted to modernize the nation overnight. Taraki would tell Soviet advisors that Afghanistan's mosques would be empty within the year, which was not only an impossible goal, it was also an extremely stupid one for a country that had such a long history with Islam. Other reforms they sought to institute around healthcare and education could have done a lot of good in a vacuum, but really just served to create a lot of enemies for a regime that desperately needed friends. Rather than compromise, the regime carried out an aggressive project of repression against their opponents. One notable victim of this repression was Hekmatyar's mentor, Professor Niazi. He and many of his fellow prisoners were loaded onto a bus and told they were being released, only to be executed en masse. In the coming decades, these men would be hailed as martyrs among Islamists all over the Middle East and Central Asia. Tensions built for a year before popping off with the Herat uprising in March of 1979. Roderick Braithwaite writes that the precise reason for the violence in Herat is still up in the air, with some attributing it to the PDPA's new policy of mandatory literacy programs for girls. Some said the order for revolt came directly from Pakistan or Iran, and others said it was led by a mutiny in the military. This goes to show exactly how many plausible enemies the PDPA had at this point. This was not a fight they could win by force. They would need to make some sort of compromise with someone here if they wanted to maintain any degree of power. But regardless of which of these elements played the largest role in sparking the uprising, the PDPA had thousands of people praying for their downfall less than a year after seizing power. The party did what would quickly become their favorite thing to do over the next decade or so. They asked the Soviets for troops. Moscow considered the request before ultimately concluding that putting boots on the ground in Afghanistan would be stupid as hell. Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin would tell President Taraki directly,
"If we sent in our troops, the situation in your country would not improve. On the contrary, it would get worse. Our troops would have to struggle not only with the external aggressor, but part of your own people, and people do not forgive that kind of thing."
Now you might be thinking, hot damn, this Kosygin fella really nailed it. If only the Soviets had heeded this advice. But the reality is that this was essentially the party line for most of the year. As the Afghan communists continued to lose control of the situation in their country, they repeatedly asked the Soviets to send in troops, and the requests were repeatedly denied on these exact grounds. They said that the Soviet troops would not help the situation, they would only make it worse. That's not to say the Soviets did not try to help, because they very much did. They continued to provide material aid throughout the year and consistently offered their advice. When Taraki told Kosygin that much of the military forces in Herat had defected to the rebels, Kosygin told the president to provide Soviet weapons to the workers, petit bourgeoisie, and white-collar workers to fight off the counter-revolutionaries. Taraki responded by saying that there really wasn't much of a working class to draw from in Afghanistan. And this is kind of problematic, right? These guys tried to do a workers' revolution and create a workers' state in a state without any workers. It was completely doomed to fail from the start. This made no sense at all. And the Soviets, for their part, tried to convey this to them repeatedly throughout the year. Braithwaite writes that when Brezhnev met with President Taraki in March of 1979, he said,
"Firmly, that the government must broaden its political base and stop shooting people." He had emphasized yet again that in the present circumstances, the Soviets would send no troops.
Again, this is good advice. Cut the communism, moderate your reforms, stop killing everyone, and find a political solution, because the military option is not viable. So how did the Soviets flip and do the exact thing they said they wouldn't do, with the exact consequences that they had foreseen? How did they become the bad guys in Aaron Sorkin's movie? What changed? The short answer is the leadership of the PDPA did. In the fall of 1979, President Taraki was arrested and killed by his second-in-command Hafizullah Amin, who assumed the presidency himself. Now, one may think that since Taraki was fucking everything up, having someone else kill and replace him could be just what the doctor ordered. The problem was that much of the repression which occurred under Taraki had actually been spearheaded by Amin. In some cases, he was just carrying out extrajudicial killings without Taraki's approval, creating further enemies for the regime. In one instance, Amin bragged to Taraki that some of their men had killed several family members of Sibghatullah Mojaddedi, a popular moderate Muslim leader. It seems likely that the massacre of his family would play a role in driving Mojaddedi to become one of the major leaders of the Mujahideen, the holy warriors fighting against the Soviets. The PDPA would also kill Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's brother, as well as his father, by tying him to the back of a jeep and dragging him through the scrubland. Now, Hekmatyar would have opposed the communists regardless, but the brutality here would only make matters worse. As one of the leaders of the Khalq wing of the party, Amin believed that to make a modern state out of Afghanistan, they needed ambitious reform, and with that, heavy-handed repressions of their opposition. He basically embodied all of Taraki's worst impulses, combined with a bloodthirsty careerist drive. The guy wanted absolute power and was willing to kill or imprison anyone who got in his way, including members of the Parcham faction of his own party. To consolidate his power, he would also send popular Parchamites like Babrak Karmal to other countries as ambassadors so they could not work against him. None of this would sit well with the Soviets. But beyond Amin's Pol Pot-esque approach to governing the country, what actually spawned the invasion were Soviet suspicions that Amin may be a CIA asset in some capacity. This part of the story is surprisingly murky, and it's hard to get definitive answers on how true a lot of the details here are, but I'll give you the gist. Amin was not educated in the Soviet Union. He actually went to school in the US. He attended Columbia University and the University of Wisconsin in the 50s and 60s. While there, he allegedly became president of the Afghanistan Students Association, which had at least one former president on the CIA payroll and received funding from the Asia Foundation, a CIA front that Amin was associated with at one point. Flash forward a few years, and the PDPA met to discuss what their government would look like. Certain party members expressed suspicions around Amin's time in the US and his possible ties to the CIA. Amin allegedly replied that he did receive funds from the CIA, but he was just a broke student who needed money, so he led them on to get some cash. American anthropologist Louis Dupree appears to back this up to some extent, saying that while Amin received US funds even back in Afghanistan, he continued to recruit his peers into the Communist Party and showed no loyalty to the Americans. Now, some authors have suggested that claims of Amin working for the CIA were created by the KGB in order to discredit him. And after doing the rounds, these false claims came back to Russia, and they just earnestly believed their own bullshit. This might be the case, but I'm a bit skeptical. It seems to me that Amin did, in fact, have some kind of wacky ties, and if this PDPA meeting did occur as reported, with Amin conceding that he received US funds but didn't let it impact his beliefs or his work, it's definitely not a great look. It didn't help his image that upon becoming president, he immediately started holding meetings with American diplomats, which not only convinced the KGB that these rumors of CIA ties were true, it actually started to make the Americans who had heard the same rumors suspicious as well. A US ambassador was worried enough that he actually asked his CIA station chief if Amin was one of their guys, to which he was told emphatically that no, Amin was not a US asset.
He just seems to act like one.
And listen, I'm the last guy to take the CIA at their word for anything, but I actually do believe them on this one. The CIA has successfully destabilized governments all over the world, but if you've read enough about them, you'll realize that these don't tend to be particularly complex operations. They give money to the most corrupt guys they can find and tell them to raise hell. It's generally not that complicated. I have a hard time believing that they were able to win over a graduate student, send his ass back to Afghanistan where he successfully leads a communist revolution against a neutral government that probably wouldn't have happened without him because the other leaders were in prison, only for him to embark on a massive campaign of repression against the counter-revolutionaries in the country who the CIA was funding, and then kill the president so that he can take over the country and then invite the Soviets in to preserve the communist government and bring about a decade-long war. I don't see it. Too many moving pieces, moving in conflicting directions, and it just doesn't seem like the kind of thing they could actually pull off. That said, we need to zoom out a little bit and understand the political climate here and why the Soviets might have believed this little conspiracy theory of theirs. Earlier in the year, the Iranian Revolution had just taken place, meaning that the CIA's favorite little freak, the Shah of Iran, had fled, and they lost an important outpost for keeping tabs on the Soviet Union. Given that the US had been trying to pull President Daoud towards the West through the Shah just a few years prior, it made sense to the Soviets that the CIA may set their sights on a country like Afghanistan, where the new government was deeply unpopular and ripe for counter-revolution. At the same time, Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB, believed that the US was trying to build a, quote, new great Ottoman Empire on the southern border of the USSR, including Afghanistan and the Central Asian Soviet republics of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Now, I wouldn't call it a reconstruction of the Ottoman Empire, but he wasn't completely off base here either, because the US did have plans to use militant Islam as a way to break off these Central Asian republics and move them away from Soviet control. Jimmy Carter's Secretary of State, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was able to put $500 million from the Carter administration towards this project as part of Operation Cyclone. But beyond this broad Cold War attitude that impacted the Soviet decision, many had been very specific in claiming that the United States, and Brzezinski specifically, had lured the Soviets into a trap in Afghanistan. The origin of this theory lies in an interview Brzezinski did with a French magazine in 1998. During the conversation, Brzezinski allegedly claimed that he had written a note to President Carter saying that providing aid to the Mujahideen rebels in the summer of 1979 would bring about a Soviet invasion. He said that they had, quote, knowingly increased the probability of the Soviets entering Afghanistan. That once his prediction came true, he had told Carter that this provided them with an opportunity to give the USSR their own Vietnam, and that he had no regrets over their, quote, excellent idea to bring about the war. Considering the fact that Afghanistan had spent pretty much every year from then until 1998 at war, it's fair to say these remarks were extremely calloused and reveal the rot at the heart of the American Cold War mindset. But despite this, the interview largely flew under the radar. It was only after 9/11 that people started to reflect on these comments and realize they were extremely evil. But some have suggested that these quotes should not be taken at face value. In 2020, historian Connor Tobin called the validity of these comments into question on a number of grounds. He pointed out that, among other things, the interview had been translated into French and then back into English, that the title of the article misquoted Brzezinski, meaning that the body of it could be misquoted as well, that Brzezinski himself had publicly denied this, and that the available documentary evidence appears to suggest that the US was trying to avoid escalating things, not to induce an invasion. Tobin effectively takes the stance that Brzezinski probably didn't say this, but if he did, he was probably just trying to gas up the Carter administration for spearheading a successful operation that seriously hurt the Soviets. In his article, he mentions that after the Herat uprising, the US became interested in Afghanistan, with Brzezinski bringing up Afghanistan repeatedly to Carter. Similarly, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Walt Slocum asked whether it made sense to support the Mujahideen to encourage the Soviets to get stuck in their own Vietnam. The CIA, on the other hand, was worried about this as a potential outcome and warned that they didn't want to get too involved lest they bring up a direct intervention from the Russians. When the US did begin supporting the rebels in July of 1979, it was largely through non-lethal means like radio broadcasting, cash payments, and humanitarian aid, allegedly with the hopes of not provoking the Soviet Union. The operation would rack up a bill of just $575,000, a far cry from the billions of dollars they would send by the 90s. While some suggested the US halt any further aid, barring a Soviet invasion, Brzezinski persisted in stating that the US needed to increase involvement. It wasn't until the Soviets finally entered Afghanistan that Jimmy Carter finally signed off on providing lethal assistance to the Mujahideen. So throughout this article, we see glimpses of Brzezinski pushing for increased US involvement, but insufficient evidence to suggest that the US had deliberately sucked the Soviets in. In fact, Brzezinski would sell these interventions as a way to deter the Soviets from going in, rather than as a way to induce them in. So overall, it's a very strong article that could do a lot to convince people that the Afghan trap is a nonsensical conspiracy theory. But I still think he's wrong. The best response to Tobin's article came from Professor Jonathan Haslam at Corpus Christi College. He pointed out that Brzezinski was known to be a rabid anti-communist who explicitly sought to bleed the Soviets in Afghanistan, a claim that has been echoed by many other authors covering the US response to the Soviet invasion. Beyond Brzezinski's general essence, he was able to corroborate his position on the Afghan trap from a few angles. First, the French interviewer who got the scoop stood by his article, stating that the quotes attributed to Brzezinski had been translated correctly. Second, Haslam writes that Bill Odom, who had reported directly to Brzezinski and later became the head of the NSA under Reagan, told him directly in 2002 that when Brzezinski heard of the Soviet invasion, he shot a celebratory fist in the air and said they have taken the bait. Now this is anecdotal, sure, but Haslam recalls the exact date Odom told him this story and corroborated it with Yale professor Arne Wested, who said he remembered the interaction, quote, very clearly. Third, Haslam also cites an admission from the CIA's former chief of the Near East and South Asian Division, Chuck Kogan, who confronted Brzezinski about his Afghan comments in 2009. Kogan challenged Brzezinski's version of events, saying that during his time at the CIA, there were no plans to induce a Soviet invasion through the aid they provided to the Mujahideen. Rather than deny the interview translation as he had publicly, Kogan claims that Brzezinski stood by the interview, saying, quote, "You may have had your own perception from the agency, but we had a different perception from the White House." To be clear, Odom and Kogan would have no reason to lie about this. We're not talking about guys who left the government and began bashing the deep state. These were two seasoned anti-communists who, by all accounts, had a great amount of respect for Brzezinski. Combine this with the fact that even Tobin's article alludes to a current of Brzezinski and others fighting hard to get aid to the Mujahideen, I think it's extremely likely that the official documents are not telling us the whole story here. I tell you this because I want to convey that the Soviet reasoning did not justify going into Afghanistan and was obviously stupid, but not completely crazy either. The CIA's plans did not run through Hafizullah Amin as they suspected, but the pieces were there. One could make the case that the perceived threat here was far greater than anything the US could have possibly been facing when they invaded Grenada or Panama. The results were just far more disastrous.
In the words of one American officer, they were using whatever it takes to free the island.
And before I completely close the book on why the Soviets ultimately pulled the trigger on the invasion, I want to dispel two common myths on why the Soviets went in. The first, which largely comes from the political right and has been propagated by many Afghans in the years since, was that the Soviets were expanding south in the hopes of securing a warm water port. Such an explanation would make the Soviet invasion nothing more than an imperialist adventure that we could all agree was just plain evil without equivocation. This explanation was provided to President Jimmy Carter and briefly had him considering the introduction of nuclear weapons to deter the Soviets. The problem with this is that the USSR was nowhere near securing one of these ports, even if it successfully took Afghanistan. And more importantly, there's just no evidence supporting the idea besides one Soviet advisor writing about it in a memoir. I don't really take this account seriously though, because out of everything written about the war, very few of these works actually consider this idea, in contrast to the reasons I already laid out, which are generally agreed upon. The second myth, which largely comes from the political left, is more niche and far more online. This is the belief that the Soviets went in to save a well-intentioned but failing regime, which was actually totally justified because the government in Afghanistan invited them in. This is a great point if you've merely skimmed the Wikipedia on the war, but if you've read a book or 7, you'll realize this is hogwash. First of all, the Afghan government under Amin almost certainly would have lost out to the counter-revolution eventually, but they actually weren't so close to collapsing that they needed immediate military intervention either. Archer K. Blood, who worked at the... forget about this guy. Archer K. Blood, who worked at the American Embassy in Afghanistan, told journalist Selig Harrison that, quote, "the regime was not in danger of falling. The whole embassy agreed on this." And sure, it could be the case that they all just misread the situation, but the American case for the next decade would more or less be that the Afghan government would collapse overnight without Soviet ground and air support, which turned out to be extremely wrong when put to the test in 1988. Now, on the second point, that the Afghans invited the Soviets in, there's two reasons this is silly. The first is that, sure, the PDPA invited them in. That is true on paper, but their claim to any sort of democratic legitimacy is virtually zero. They rode an extremely convenient wave into power, but their support among the Afghan population was minimal. Their membership numbered in the tens of thousands. Even on a military level, people were defecting to the resistance on a massive scale. The idea that a government like this can just unilaterally invite a superpower in to start shooting their enemies is laughable. But more importantly, and I cannot stress this enough, they shot the guy that invited them in. They blew him up with a grenade and killed his kid. The first order of business was killing Hafizullah Amin and installing the Parchamite Babrak Karmal as the president to moderate the country's reform program. This isn't stabilizing a friendly regime. This is regime change, full stop. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the war was a nightmare. Going into a foreign country to just remove an autocracy and not get bogged down in a long-term war effort is easier said than done. The US has tried this strategy in both Iraq and Afghanistan and failed both times. But it is possible. One could argue that Vietnam did this to remove Pol Pot in Cambodia. The efforts of the Vietnamese were not frowned upon anywhere near as much as the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Let's dig into this war itself and get an idea of why that may be the case. Right out of the gate, the invasion was a little bit messy. When the Soviets touched down in Kabul, they met with their host, President Amin, and had dinner. In the process, they had him poisoned in the hopes of killing him. But because the left hand didn't talk to the right, and word didn't get around to all the interested parties that Amin was supposed to die, a Soviet doctor named Anatoly Amiv proceeded to nurse him back to health. A few hours later, the Soviets would launch an attack on the presidential palace, shooting Amin and blowing him up with a grenade, killing his son for good measure. With his death and the installation of Babrak Karmal as the new president, the Soviets had officially announced their presence in Afghanistan. This initial invasion actually killed fewer people than the United States did in their invasion of Panama, so it was not a complete disaster by any means. Had the Soviets immediately withdrawn, we wouldn't be talking about any of this right now. But instead, they stuck around and things got much, much worse. In the immediate aftermath of the invasion, the Soviets found many of the Afghans to be relatively friendly. On some level, they appeared to welcome the overthrow of President Amin, but for the next 9 years, they were plagued by a number of issues that made winning the war impossible. The Soviets found that many of the Afghans were strangely detached from the country's politics. Journalist Greg Pfeiffer wrote in his book on the war that many Afghan civilians were happy to see the Soviets, but had no idea who Babrak Karmal was, despite him being the newly minted president. In fact, they thought Daoud Khan was still president, meaning they didn't know about Taraki or Amin either. They had 3 presidents die within 2 years, and they were completely unaware of it. Incidents like this spoke to a common issue throughout Afghan history that persists to this day. The Afghan state has always been weak and has struggled to actually incorporate the countryside into the Afghan national identity. People on the margins tend to resist attempts to bring them into the fold in favor of continuing in a more traditional, tribal manner. This has been a huge roadblock to turning Afghanistan into a developed capitalist country, let alone a communist one. The only reason communism had sprung up as a movement at all was because of Kabul's development into a relatively modern city with capitalistic property relations and a decent number of Marxists in the police and military. To much of the rural population, however, the struggles of the Kabul working class were completely irrelevant. The countryside had been doing things the same way for generations and had no intentions of changing. This ambivalence to the government's agenda was one thing, but perhaps the most pressing issue for the next 9 years was that the Soviets could not stop killing civilians. Despite giving a lot of good advice to the PDPA prior to the invasion around broadening their base and tempering their brutality, the Soviets did not conduct themselves in a more humane manner. This was partially due to the Soviets simply refusing to engage with the Mujahideen on the ground and instead opting to use their superior air capabilities to bomb the country indiscriminately. While some of these campaigns did kill Mujahideen fighters, the primary victims of the bombings were innocent civilians, with hundreds of thousands being killed and many more displaced. The Soviets also opened themselves up to a slam-dunk propaganda campaign in which they were accused of dropping bombs disguised as toys meant to maim children. Now, it is not true that the Soviets ever created bombs specifically to kill children, but it is true that their butterfly mines, which were littered on the paths that the Mujahideen were known to take, were genuinely believed to be toys by children. Regardless of the Soviet intent here, the result was dead and disfigured children, and they were absolutely pummeled in the media for it. Soviet conduct throughout the war can best be summarized by a story told in Pfeiffer's book, The Great Gamble. He writes of a Russian soldier taking part in a bombing raid at night, wherein the pilots noticed some headlights below them. They were instructed to fire on these vehicles and did so. When they came back to inspect the site the next day, they were shot at by an old man with a rifle who they killed. What they found on the ground was that they had largely just murdered women and children the night before. The only living person they uncovered was an injured 3-year-old girl who was likely being protected by the elderly man they had just killed. The soldiers bandaged up the little girl's hand, shot her in the head, and set her body on fire with the rest. I tell this story because I will periodically see people defend the invasion on the grounds that the Soviets built schools and hospitals in Afghanistan. To limit their intervention to something like this would be the same as me telling you this story as one about a Soviet soldier bandaging up the hand of a little girl whose family had been killed. Regardless of their intentions, the Soviets inflicted an unbelievable amount of suffering on the Afghan population. Roderick Braithwaite writes that it's extremely difficult to pin down the death figures on the Afghan side, but it likely falls somewhere between 600,000 and 1.5 million dead and millions more displaced. For reference, America's war in Afghanistan went on for over twice as long and killed well under 300,000 Afghans. To really drive this point home, you can pull up a graph of Afghanistan's population over time and visibly see exactly when the Soviets invaded and when they left, because the country's population actually goes down and doesn't increase again until they're gone. This was an unbelievable amount of suffering to inflict upon a country on the grounds that you need to take preemptive action to avoid having an enemy on your border. Beyond the brutality of the war itself, there was a complete failure among the Afghan leadership. Although the Soviet-picked president Babrak Karmal was not as psychotic as Taraki or Amin was when it came to mass murder, he was not able to meet the moment either. He was uninspiring, arrogant, and a heavy drinker in a country where this was extremely frowned upon for obvious reasons. Under his leadership, the Afghan military went from having 110,000 troops to just 30,000 by 1985. The Soviets felt that the blame for this fell on Karmal, as he tended to lock himself in the presidential palace in fear of his enemies outside of the party as well as those within it. It's likely that the mass desertion in the armed forces had more to do with the Soviets killing civilians on a near industrial scale, but they were correct to conclude that Karmal was largely hated and needed to go. This meant that when the Soviet Union, now under Mikhail Gorbachev, began moving towards withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, they forced Karmal out of power, which he didn't take particularly well, as he kicked, screamed, pissed, and moaned on the way out. The Soviets would then replace him with a leading figure in the Parcham wing of the party, Najibullah, or as his friends would call him, Dr. Najib. You may remember him as the beefy medical student who used to clash with the Muslim youth at Kabul University in the 1960s. After briefly being exiled as an ambassador to Iran during the Kalki administration, he had quickly risen to the head of the Afghan intelligence service under Karmal. The Soviets grew to love Dr. Najib for his bombastic personality, believing him to be equal parts clever and brutal. Although he had presided over the intelligence service at a time when they did away with summary executions and offered some degree of due process to detainees, human rights were not a priority either. Under Najibullah's leadership, torture would no longer be used as a means to simply punish prisoners, but its use for information gathering was endemic. One of Hekmatyar's followers would report that Najibullah personally punched him in the face and knocked out 2 of his teeth when he arrived at the facility. From there, he was burned, electrocuted, and tied to the ceiling to be forced to watch as 2 girls and a woman were sexually assaulted in the other cell. Now, this kind of thing is indefensible, but Najibullah was undoubtedly the most capable leader the PDPA had ever produced for Afghanistan. The Soviets put him in charge because they needed someone to shore up the regime before they could withdraw troops. The replacement of Babrak Karmal was also requested by Pakistan as a precondition to signing off on any withdrawal plans. They insisted that Karmal could be replaced by his own twin brother or even a clone. They just could not sell the idea of Karmal staying in power to their people. Ultimately, it wouldn't make much of a difference because the people who hated them would go on to hate Najibullah just the same, but it was a show of good faith at the very least. Now, the US would go on to claim that the Soviets withdrew because the Stinger missiles provided by the CIA were so effective that the Soviets had to tuck tail and run, but this is simply not true. The Soviets left Afghanistan because Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and before the Stinger was even introduced had called the war, quote, a bleeding wound and said it needed to end. Even one of his predecessors, Yuri Andropov, had attempted to negotiate a withdrawal a few years prior, but died before he could get anywhere. One can understand why they wanted out when you recognize that the country had lost over 10,000 soldiers by this point in a war that was unpopular at home and even more unpopular abroad, with absolute victory pretty much out of the question, Stinger missiles or not. The Soviets would complete their withdrawal on February 15, 1989, leaving the country in ruins. While they would continue to fund the Najibullah regime with around $3 billion per year, and the Americans and the Saudis continued to funnel hundreds of millions to the resistance, the war started to resemble the street fights at Kabul University in the 60s. It was a war between the brutal Najib trying to modernize his country and the fractured Islamists who sought to set the clock back hundreds of years. But this time, instead of bats and knives, both sides were using the deadliest weapons money could buy, and they would use them to shatter whatever remained of Afghanistan. Although this is a video about why the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, it's just as much about why this decision matters. To fully grasp this, we need to see the consequences of what they left behind. Before I close this out, I'm going to give you a short summary of how this war finally came to an end. Last we left off with the Islamists, the powder keg had been lit in the rivalry between Hekmatyar and the more moderate Rabbani and Massoud. At that point, all 3 of these guys were relatively fringe figures still. When Afghans first began rising up against the oppression of the Taraki administration in the late 70s, they did so completely independently of the Islamists hiding out in Pakistan. It wasn't until the summer of 1979, 6 months before the Soviet invasion, that these Islamists, now known as the Mujahideen or Holy Warriors, began receiving funding from the United States. The $500,000 that was sent to them would pale in comparison to the hundreds of millions they would go on to receive towards the end of the conflict. Despite being talked about as though the Mujahideen constituted one united front, they were actually made up of hundreds of different groups, though the vast majority of them fell into 7 groups who received the bulk of the external funding. The lesser 3 of these groups were the moderate nationalist factions, one of which was led by Segbatullah Mojaddedi, who I mentioned earlier as a respected figure whose family had been killed by Amin under the Taraki regime. These groups were not favored by the Pakistani intelligence service because of ideological differences, and they didn't receive much love from the CIA because they simply weren't as good at killing Soviets as their more brutal radical allies. The remaining 4 parties were the radical fundamentalists. These included Jamiat Islami, which was led by Rabbani and Massoud, and Hizb Islami, led by Hekmatyar. One of Hekmatyar's allies, Yunis Khalis, would splinter off from Hizb and form his own group, which he creatively titled Hizb Islami. And then in brackets, Khalis. He was a fighter, not a thinker. Alongside Khalis was his clerical commander, Jalaluddin Haqqani, who would work for the CIA to organize Arab foreigners into the war against the Soviets, which would lay the ground for Al-Qaeda, a group that Haqqani would help to escape US capture in 2001 alongside Hekmatyar. For more details on the 9/11 stuff, you can check out our Charlie Wilson's War video because it's beyond the scope of this one. Haqqani would go on to fight alongside Al-Qaeda against US forces and become the US's number 3 target in the region after Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban. Haqqani's son, Sirajuddin, would go on to become deputy leader of the Taliban after Mullah Omar's death. Great family. The last fundamentalist party was Ittihad-e-Islami, which was led by Abdul Rab Razul Sayyaf, who had been Rabbani's deputy at Kabul University. Sayyaf subscribed to the Salafi strain of Islam, generally called Wahhabism, which was predominant in Saudi Arabia, so he largely got a seat at the table through their influence. Though Salafism tended to be more extreme than the traditional forms of Islam found in Afghanistan, Sayyaf would go on to become a fierce critic of the Taliban post 9/11. Throughout the war with the Soviets, these guys were generally on the same page in believing that it was the occupying force that represented the great evil, but the rivalry between Hekmatyar's Hizb and Massoud's Jamiat would repeatedly bubble over. Massoud would further incense Hekmatyar by agreeing to a ceasefire with the Soviets in 1982, which would last until April of 1984. He had agreed to this in order to protect the civilians in the Panjshir Valley who had been subjected to repeated Soviet attacks over the war, as well as to rearm and focus on his long-term strategy to defeat the Soviets, and ultimately Hizb as well. For his part, Hekmatyar came to believe that Massoud was actively conspiring with the Soviets to kill him and his followers. And while Massoud was not collaborating with the Soviets, it was true that his forces were killing Hekmatyar's, but this was generally a reaction to Hekmatyar doing the same to him. Hekmatyar's attacks on Massoud were so frequent that some CIA analysts began to suspect that perhaps Hekmatyar was actually a KGB agent, though this would not slow the flood of money and weapons going disproportionately to Hekmatyar and his allies. All of this is critically important to understand how this war ended. Once the Soviets left, the consensus in the West was that Najibullah's regime would quickly succumb to the Mujahideen. It seems that our humble freedom fighters bought into this idea as well, as they would ramp up their attacks on one another in the hopes of being the ones to ultimately topple the regime. While they became more divided, Najibullah began to brand himself as a unity candidate of sorts. He announced a national reconciliation program offering amnesty to Mujahideen who had laid down their weapons. He promised a multi-party democracy which would include non-PDPA candidates and called a national assembly to draft a new constitution which changed the name of the country from the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan with this incredibly communist flag back to the Republic of Afghanistan with the more traditional Afghan colors. He also took the advice that the Soviets had given his predecessors and pivoted the party program away from communism and began to style himself as a Pashtun nationalist who was resisting the subversion of the Pakistani government. Perhaps most important for his continued survival, Najibullah needed to increase his strength. It was believed that the Mujahideen had over 180,000 men at their disposal, which was far greater than Najibullah had in his military. Once the Soviets had left, however, many of the Mujahideen felt they had fulfilled their duty and laid down their weapons. This forced fundamentalists like Hekmatyar, Sayyaf, and Haqqani to rely more heavily on Arab recruits. Given that many of them would go on to end up working for Osama bin Laden in the mid-90s, it should come as no surprise that these volunteers tended to be far more brutal than their Afghan peers. They would become known for killing civilians who they believed were apostates simply for living peacefully under the Afghan government rather than actively trying to overthrow it. All of this worked in Najibullah's favor, but he was still in charge of a military that did not have a strong record of respecting human rights either. For these reasons, he would pivot towards funding independent Afghan warlords to fight in the rural areas that the government could not comfortably reach with their depleted reserves. The most prominent warlord to receive massive amounts of funds from the government was Abdul Rashid Dostum, who we'll come back to a little bit later. Najibullah would hope that these changes, alongside massive funds from the Soviets, would be enough to keep him in power and find some sort of settlement that would allow him to keep his head on his shoulders. Despite government efforts to open back channels to Hekmatyar and Massoud, the Mujahideen would make a major push to topple the country by attacking the city of Jalalabad. Although the Mujahideen had far greater numbers, this was fundamentally different from what they had been doing for the last 9 years. The Mujahideen had mastered the art of the hit and run, not siege warfare. So when they made their move, they spent months on the attack, but Jalalabad did not fall. In addition to their relative inexperience in this form of combat, infighting amongst the Mujahideen would play a major part in this failure. Massoud had promised the CIA that he would assist with the operation by blocking the government's resupply route. But upon realizing that the city would not fall, he opted to not waste the lives of his men and abandoned the route, allowing the government forces to ambush Hekmatyar's troops, killing thousands of them. Despite the relative success in Jalalabad and Najib's competence relative to his predecessors, the cracks were beginning to show within the PDPA. The Soviets had managed to play babysitter and enforce party discipline that united the Khalqis and the Parchamites within the government. But without their influence, many began to question their loyalty to the president. A Khalqi member named Ashif Shur would go on to hatch a plan to overthrow Najibullah and bring Hekmatyar to power alongside Defense Minister Shahnawaz Tanai. Najibullah would shut this down with relative ease, but it betrayed a sense of disunity within the government now that the Soviets no longer had troops on the ground. For his part, Massoud would claim that the coup had been stopped by his men who had infiltrated the military. It's not clear how true this is, but it was absolutely the case that Massoud and Hekmatyar continued to work against each other to Najibullah's benefit. The Mujahideen infighting was so bad that they did not even directly bring about Najibullah's downfall. In December of 1991, amidst the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans and the Russians finally agreed to stop funding their respective sides of the war. Najib then immediately signed a UN transition plan that would see him lose power, but it was too late. As early as January of 1992, Najib no longer had the funds to continue paying his Afghan warlords in the north. Dostum immediately mutinied and seized custom posts to pay himself and his fellow militias. When the president attempted to flee the country, he was blocked by Dostum, possibly Massoud, and even Karmal loyalists. After being betrayed by the Khalq wing of his party, then the warlords, and now the Parchamites, there was nothing Najib could do but hide in a UN compound, awaiting his fate as his transition plan had been made null. With Najibullah gone, there was nothing stopping the Mujahideen from taking power but themselves. They would immediately shatter and reassemble themselves into various short-lived coalitions, all the while bombing what remained of their country. The city of Kabul, which had remained relatively untouched throughout much of the war, was completely destroyed. Hekmatyar's forces would shell the city and kill 50,000 people, the vast majority of whom were civilians. This violence would destroy 40% of Kabul's housing and drop the population from 2 million to 500,000. With the PDPA completely dead, the Khalqis would side with Hekmatyar, while many of the Parchamites would side with Massoud. Picking sides would prove to be a wise decision because Massoud's men would go on to carry out extrajudicial killings against communist officials against the wishes of President Mojadedi, who had granted them amnesty. Despite being more moderate than Hekmatyar, who wanted to kick off a global jihad, Massoud's men were still fundamentalists who instituted Sharia law banning alcohol and forcing women to cover themselves. Their brutality proved to rival that of Hekmatyar, as they would decapitate the elderly, execute children as young as 11, and carry out systematic among Hazari neighborhoods in Kabul. Because of these atrocities and shifting alliances at the top of the old Mujahideen factions, the civil war seemed endless. The country had largely fallen into anarchy, with various warlords running toll roads to extort local populations. It was within this environment that Afghanistan's future regime finally took shape. An entire generation of Afghan men had been born and raised in wartime conditions. Without a place to call home, they were trained in religious schools in the east called madrasas. In light of Massoud's men shooting civilians for sport and Dostum's dressing young boys in girls' clothing before raping them, these students, or as they were known in the communities, Taliban, decided to take matters into their own hands. Their original goal was simply to secure the highway connecting Kandahar to Herat to allow for civilian travel without fear of bandits. This narrow goal would elicit support from Pakistan, who needed these routes for commerce, and even Massoud and Rabbani, as they saw a group of young men with similar enough beliefs restoring order to their country. By the time the Jamiat leaders came to their senses and sought to unify against the Taliban, it was too late. They'd built up too much momentum, and they absolutely rolled what remained of the Mujahideen to seize Afghanistan and turn it into a brutal theocracy that wouldn't fall until the US intervened after 9/11. So what was accomplished here? At the start of our story, I introduced some of our principal characters, and absolutely none of them got what they wanted. Daoud Khan attempted to make Afghanistan into something resembling a moderate, liberal-ish country, and it sent him to an unmarked grave with his entire family. Mohammad Taraki wanted to be Afghanistan's Lenin, but instead, he was smothered by a pillow at the orders of Afghanistan's Pol Pot. Hafizullah Amin wanted to bring the Soviets into Afghanistan to stabilize his regime. Instead, they murdered him and plunged his country into decades of war. Najibullah wanted to create a more moderate Afghanistan that more closely resembled the Soviet Central Asian republics, but instead, he left behind a legacy as a mass-murdering torturer and suffered one of the more brutal deaths imaginable at the hands of the Taliban when they seized Kabul. You can check this footnote if you want to learn more about how they did it, but I can assure you you're better off without it. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar attempted to turn Afghanistan into the base of a global jihad that would unite the Muslim world and tear down the decadent West. And although his good friends in Al-Qaeda did carry out 9/11 and his ideas trickled down to ISIS a few years down the line, the West is still very much alive, and he has been forced to sit on the sidelines and watch as the Taliban routed his men and managed to seize power in Afghanistan twice, something he was never able to do successfully. Massoud sought to defeat both the communists and the more radical elements of Islam in Afghanistan. And although he did largely get the better of Hekmatyar, he was routed by the Taliban as well and was killed by Al-Qaeda in a suicide bombing 2 days before 9/11 and never got to see his allies in the Northern Alliance hold Afghanistan. Massoud's closest ally, Rabbani, had always hoped to lead the Afghan Islamist movement, but when he finally seized the presidency, he simply oversaw a disastrous civil war before losing out to the Taliban alongside Massoud. Unlike most of his peers, he would live to see the US occupation, but he would be killed in a suicide bombing as well. Combined, these men had millions of followers hoping for the same things. But when all was said and done, well over 1 million of them were dead, and their hopes and aspirations went with them. Instead, their country had been turned into a wasteland headed by a man who could restore order at a tremendous cost, both in terms of the people they killed to take power and regards to the dignity of the women and the girls they would subjugate under their rule. And these people matter. Both those who lost their lives because they were caught between two superpowers during the Cold War, and those who suffered under a despotic regime when that war ended. But the lessons we learn here go beyond just Afghanistan. What we see here continues to be relevant to you today. And to close this out, I'll explain how. I started this off by pointing out that Aaron Sorkin wrote a movie about the Soviet-Afghan War and centered it entirely around the bureaucracy in Washington and Langley. Despite his advice to aspiring writers that they should humanize their villains, he didn't do that. Hell, he didn't really flesh out the guys shooting the villains either. And not doing that is bad writing. The last 50 years of Afghanistan could easily carry a Game of Thrones level drama if anyone wanted it to. But that's not what I care about. What matters here is that adapting historical events gives you the opportunity to impart knowledge to people that they may not otherwise get because they don't have the time to pick up a book about the topic. And by not telling the audience why the Soviets invaded, you are doing them a disservice. As viewers, we need to understand the intentions of the Soviets when invading, because the intentions themselves were not evil, but the war that followed absolutely was. The USSR would admit it themselves, passing a resolution saying that their intervention in Afghanistan was, quote, deserving of moral and political condemnation. This provides the writer with the opportunity to tell the audience that the nature of war is not determined by the intentions you go in with, it's defined by what you do with it. And by not learning about why the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, we are doomed to repeat these mistakes, as the US did in both Afghanistan and Iraq. They went in to install friendly governments and in the process killed hundreds of thousands of people while creating more enemies for themselves. This is still relevant today because we are seeing something similar occur right now in Palestine. After learning about all of this, I have an extremely hard time imagining that Israel can bomb Palestine to the point that most of its sanitational and educational infrastructure is destroyed, turning the country into 42 million tons of rubble, and walk away with a more moderate, friendly regime in power, whether Hamas is destroyed or not. But this isn't about Israel specifically. Hell, it's not even about the Soviets or the Afghans. This is about war. It's about the things we tell ourselves to believe that war is justified, only to come around years later and conclude that things got out of hand, which we do every single time. In Roderick Braithwaite's book on the Soviet-Afghan War, he discussed the work of former medical officer Mikhail Reshetnikov, saying,
He wrote some of the dreadful things which had happened in Afghanistan. The rebel sniper captured and burned alive by the soldier whose comrade he had killed. The small boy hurled from a helicopter. The young girl hit by a whole platoon. The scores of peaceful civilians shot. The villages destroyed of revenge. His conclusions were stark. All wars lead to an epidemic of immorality, he argued. Genuine heroism and self-sacrificial comradeship do of course exist, but they are always accompanied in all wars and in all armies by murder, torture, cruelty to prisoners, and violent looting, especially when the army is operating outside its territory. The sense of guilt, the need to atone for what they have done, comes to the soldiers later.
I bring up the Israel-Palestine conflict not just because it's topical, but also because the discourse that occurred after October 7th repeated all the same mistakes that were made going into this war and the ones that followed in Afghanistan and Iraq. The important question to ask before invading another country is not, are our goals noble? The question is, how many peaceful civilians are you willing to shoot? How many villages are you willing to destroy? And how much are you willing to sanction in the pursuit of your goals? If the answer to any of these is none, then war is not the answer. Alright, that's the kind of grim note I like to leave us on for what will likely be the last of what we'll be doing on Afghanistan for the foreseeable future. Someday we'll do a breakdown of the US war, but there's a lot of stuff we want to get through first. I know these videos take a little bit longer to come out than we'd all like, so if you want to check out some additional podcasts we've done to follow up on our other videos and get access to early content, check out our Patreon where we post monthly. All of our YouTube content is pretty much guaranteed to be demonetized due to the graphic subject matter, so your Patreon support really does mean a lot. You can get a discount code on your first month of membership using the discount code BURNER. We have a lot of good stuff coming down the pipe, and I hope to see you all yelling at us all in the comments when they come along. See ya, nerds.